in many places. Governments, sometimes aid agencies, other people are often concerned about the price of water because water is seen to be, and obviously is, a basic need of people that they need to have access to. And so there is the politics of water militate in favor of low prices. It is not the case like that in telecommunications. Telecommunications, cell phones, for example, have been, atmospherically at least, been more regarded as luxury goods for poor people. Nobody has cared about controlling prices. And the outcome of this is that people have access to telephones, but not to water. Because basically, when there is enough cash flow in a project, then it can be financed, and you'll find providers who deliver this, whether they're public or private, is actually, relatively speaking, relative to the pricing issue, immaterial. But when there is no money, no cash flow, and most water prices are barely adequate to cover operating costs in the world, then you don't see actual projects coming about. And that's what it is about, pricing of water, not new innovative partnerships. Innovative partnerships can always be found when there is enough cash flow, but without enough cash flow, there won't be. And that's what empirical evidence suggests very strongly. And if we think that people actually are unable to pay the prices that may be necessary to deliver a basic service, then we have the options of actually being explicit and providing subsidies on the basis of service delivered rather than on upfront when it's not clear whether the service will actually function and when the risks might actually be shifted to taxpayers. So output-based aid schemes of that type, here's a picture from a Cambodian village for small-scale water systems, can actually work quite well. And for those who want to marry the notion of affordable pricing with bankable products and projects, that's the way that can be gone. And then yet another mechanism that is much talked about in recent years to bring private sector efficiency to development and social problems. Again, under this, it may be under the heading of corporate social responsibility or more broadly, public-private partnerships again. And I would argue there are three mechanisms why firms might do good things that also are in the interest of the firms. Or, you know, all the slogans, do good by doing well, or do well by doing good, etc. The first mechanism is win-win solutions, which, for example, would exist in a number of energy efficiency schemes. The private sector may help reduce greenhouse gas emissions because it is already profitable to conduct some energy efficiency improvements. Insulating houses may just, because of the cost equation, be a profitable thing, and so there's a win-win thing. Private profit drives you towards something that is also useful for society and the planet in this case. The other mechanism is the private sector may do good things or meets broader social goals if customers are willing to pay for those. So this is the ethical consumer, the people who want to pay extra for fair trade coffee, for example, or for clothes that are stitched together with fair labor practices, etc., etc. And that, of course, is also something that can work. But at the same time, as best as we can tell for the moment, these are niche products. These are small percentages of total markets and by no means sufficient to reach the goals that we all would like to aspire to. And then there's a third mechanism. And the cartoons that are in here, and I'll read them, are a little unfair, but anyway, they make the point. So on the left-hand side, there's the CEO saying, why do I have to pretend to care when I don't, and I don't? And I know there are a lot of CEOs that do care, so this is just overdoing it, as cartoons sometimes do. And his general counsel tries to calm him down. The point is, a lot of things that are done in corporate social responsibility are done under the heading of the license to operate. Companies may need to maintain a license to operate because if they don't behave in certain ways, for example in mining projects, then communities may suffer, they may revolt against the project, governments may come down on the private sector with new regulation, etc. And is that threat of regulation or the threat of protest with ultimate regulation, which gives companies the incentive to do what is right for society. And that's the third, and arguably, I would argue from everything we know, the biggest mechanism that is at work. Now, this is to some degree, for those of you in companies know that many times staff members of the companies themselves feel very strongly about particular social concerns or environmental ones and push for this. But without that pushing from inside and the pushing from outside, it is hard to see why there would be any broad-based development of this type in the corporate sector. There's only one study from all the studies that I'm aware of that has actually ever tried to halfway decently study the effects of schemes like voluntary programs by the private sector. That's the Responsible Care Program in the chemical industry. And there basically the two main findings are that the companies who are part of that program of responsible care do something, but they don't do more than companies that are not part of the program. So it's okay, but doesn't seem to do anything much by itself. And the companies who are in the program are actually, or were, the ones with bigger environmental issues than the ones outside. And so it's consistent with a story whereby everybody is being pushed a little bit by developments in the world to improve, and those who feel they're particularly in the limelight pull themselves together and have a better approach to managing their reputation. Does the iPhone do that, or is a BlackBerry required? Okay. I do have a cell phone, but it's not a BlackBerry, so I thought Steve Jobs would take care of this. I'll turn this one off. Maybe it'll work. And I'll conclude with a very broad point, not the little sectoral points that I made before, if you wish. And that's, you talk about paradigms in this conference. So read the left-hand statement. Lawsuits would increase to a frightful amount if people were not afraid of tribunals and if they felt confident of always finding in them ready and perfect justice. I desire, therefore, that those who have recourse to the tribunals should be treated without any pity and in such a manner that they should be disgusted with law and tremble to appear before a magistrate. This is a particular approach to governance and judicial systems, etc. And history appears to have given the verdict that this doesn't seem to work so well. The other, what we do see in history is that what distinguishes modern government from personal control is its unremitting character. To be governed is to be subject to the regular pressure of an authority operating to fixed rules. In a full sense of the word, it is arguable that nobody was governed before the later 19th century. That seems to have been what evolution of societies has shown us. And therefore, rule-based development is key to success, to economic progress. Economic progress is associated with more rules. We can decry them, etc. And all this work like doing business, etc., which has been made, is really about making the rules work better, but not about abolishing them. And that's part of the equation. But we also all know that if rules stifle innovation and stifle new things, that can be a problem. So this brings us to the other thing. This is a slide illustrating Paul Romer's view of economic growth, if you wish. It's taken from Peter Drucker example. All growth processes can be understood as creating building blocks, which then get recombined into other building blocks. And so here are a few building blocks: the punch card, the calculating machine, logic, the binary system, etc. And these innovations finally were put together by clever people and gave us the PC. And so growth processes are the creation of building blocks. There are lots of experiments that try to put them together in different ways, and that is what then creates productivity improvements and growth overall. And so for growth processes to occur, and growth processes are the sine qua non for poverty reduction, we need open systems that enable experiments and innovation. And so we have to, if history is any guide, we need to be able to put together rule-based systems with openness. And that, of course, is what we're all striving to do. And I would argue, this is the last slide, so you don't need to worry about much more on this. In recent times, we've talked a lot about, or in recent decades, about the discussion of state versus the market, which actually is not a very interesting discussion. And it has been discussed, or to give it faces, you could say this is the trend from Marx to Hayek, the two guys in the middle. And there's, of course, there was a trend, there is still a little bit, but not that much anymore, with the fall of communism, etc., from central planning to more market-based systems. But the long-run trend, I would argue, that is there, and that is much more important at the end of the day, is the one from Louis XIV, Louis XIV, the King of France, who allegedly said, "L'État c'est moi, I'm the state, I'm making the rules, I'm not subject to any rules," to Mrs. Leuthard, who knows her? The lady on the upper left, upper right. Anybody know who she is? Okay, we're in the United States, yes. No, even in other countries, nobody knows that. It's the president of Switzerland. The president of Switzerland, the presidency of Switzerland is a job that changes every year, or it's a position that changes every year. There's a new person in that, so you have to update these slides every year. And in some sense, why am I putting this? It's not because of her, but in some sense, this is a symbol of rule-based systems that transcend individuals, and where individuals, not that Switzerland does everything right, but as a symbol, this trend from the ruler who is on top of everybody to the ruler who is subject to rules, that is the big trend. And the trick then is to combine openness with rule-based systems. In markets, we call that competition. In politics, we call it democracy. And markets and democracy have these features that they're open to new things, like in Britain at the moment, maybe. And then one of the most important things, other than allowing new things to happen, is to cut off bad things. When I was chief economist of the Royal Dutch Shell Group, and we tried to compare ourselves to Exxon, and Exxon seemed to have better profit results most of the years when I was there, at least. It seemed, does Exxon have better projects? No, it didn't seem to be the case. Both companies seem to have broadly equally good opportunities. But why is Exxon outperforming? Well, because they're able to cut off the big tail of lousy projects much more ruthlessly than the company I was with at the time. And so we need a mechanism that weeds out failure. Again, productivity growth, that's the biggest thing, arguably, for getting average practice to best practice in the world, which is one of the biggest drivers of productivity growth and income generation. And so a mechanism to stop mistakes. And stopping mistakes, everybody who manages anything knows if you tell somebody you're making a mistake and you should stop it, then you're getting a lot of feedback. No? So, no, it's not a mistake, and it'll be okay, and it's actually better, and no, don't stop me. So if you have an impersonal mechanism that stops mistakes, that works much better. It may not feel very good either, but it actually works better. So competition in markets that weed out the firms that don't perform that well or the projects, and competition in politics that weed out the parties that do not perform that well is actually one of the single most important things for growth and poverty reduction. And at the same time, particularly in democracy, if you are able to have a system like elections that allows new things to happen, cut off bad things, and in the process maintain a modicum of legitimacy, which elections, broadly speaking, can do. Not always, but can do. That is really the holy grail of development and something for paradigmatic discussion. Thank you very much.
Up here because I'm too short and you can't see me otherwise. So we've got some time now. If we can take questions, we've got 3 roving microphones, so if people can raise their hands. And, you know, I can't actually see anything from here. So if the ladies that have the microphones. Oh, there's a hand up there. A lot of food for thought here. Yes. Oh, sorry. Did you see her there?
Right here.
Oh, okay. All right. You
Sorry.
first.
Hi, I'm Abby Davidson-Maffei from CARE. Thank you for a lot of food for thought in that rich discussion. I would just encourage, the private sector is obviously a powerful force for development, but I would encourage us and challenge us to think harder about how we can make some of these connections work for the poorest of the poor. When you're looking at access to credit, for example, a lot of the women that we work with across Africa aren't at the level yet where they would be relevant for some of the IFC's programs. And like M-Pesa is an excellent example of technology, is working well for some savings-led and other microfinance groups, but for us it's too costly for the people who live, are saving maybe 50 cents a week. So I would just encourage us to think even further about how to make these connections work for the poorest of the poor.
All right, that was more of a comment. Do you have any?
Yeah, I just would say that being ready for the IFC does not constitute development. So, but the being ready for private sector delivery, lots of people are. Most poor people actually have no particular delivery from governments, and private solutions is what dominates in poor people's lives.
Right. Okay, over there.
Okay. Lori Timmerman, Rural Development Specialist. I just wanted to bring the case of Vietnam that has this remarkable track record of reducing its poverty from 70 to 30% in 15 years, which would seem to argue that there's some role for central planning in doing this. And you can, many democratic governments also have some mechanism for strategic planning, long-term planning, to do actions now that get you to a goal like Millennium Development Challenge goals. So,
Want to collect some?
Yeah.
You want to collect some questions, or?
Well, we'll take
okay.
them.
Okay. Well, on Vietnam, the piece I know a little bit about is the private sector development, not in the rural sector where the original impetus for growth came from, but in the sectors like manufacturing and services, etc. And for a long time, between the end of the war in 1975 and the real takeoff of growth in the private sector, there was a debate about the balance between government and private initiative. And then in the year 2000, the enterprise law was passed, and that was, in retrospect, the watershed for further and dynamic development. And I would think that Vietnam has found a way, with great difficulties, but found it very well, that allowed private initiative to come about. And like in China, to some degree, private firms have started anticipating before the laws were passed that the government was moving in a direction. And so, for example, in China, you saw a lot of private initiative before private property was actually guaranteed. So in retrospect, that expectation was validated. And in Vietnam also, I would say that a conscious effort to improve the basis for private markets has given a lot of success. What do we learn about? So the interplay of government and private sector is obviously important. Whether I would call what Vietnam has done central planning, I'm not so sure. And also, the word long-term planning, it's good to Mr. Eisenhower said plans are useless, but planning is indispensable. And so governments that actually think, have debates, etc., and make policies that allow their citizens to do things, and at the same time create rule-based systems that combine initiative with some social conscience, those are important things, but I wouldn't think central planning in any traditional definition is part of the equation.
Thank you.
It's not my iPhone, is it?
Yes. Oh. Can we have a microphone up here and then there's a microphone.
Right here, Michael.
Oh, okay, let's start with him and then
It's Kishore Rao from Deloitte. Michael, great to get a good old-fashioned sense of the importance of the business environment and the removal of constraints. And I guess my question to you is, one of the themes of this conference is new development paradigms for 2010. And from my perspective, there seems to be a lot of interest to move from things of the past which emphasize removing regulatory constraints or impediments, and some of the issues that you discussed in your very interesting presentation, to much more direct and much more urgent approaches to poverty alleviation through, for example, food security and some of the other aspects. I just want your comments given your experience on what we can. Do you endorse this? Do you see this as a new way forward, and what can we learn from what's been tried before by the bank and other development institutions in sort of this moving from market-based approaches, and I'm being slightly provocative, to much more direct approaches for poverty alleviation? Thank you.
Yeah, that debate gets interesting when it gets really concrete, because at some level, the piece of the debate that I'm most familiar with is not so much about food security, but more about industrial policy. So where it has been argued that what we, myself included, at some part, in part of the World Bank, I should say, have argued about approaches to regulation might be at odds with what people like Danny Roderick at Harvard, etc., have said. And when you look at the details, I don't see all that much difference, but let me try and work this through. If there are people who say you just have to do broad, economy-wide regulatory reform, like those actions captured by the so-called Doing Business Project, improve property rights, open up the markets, reduce unnecessary regulation, and then everything will happen, that's probably not the right approach. And I wouldn't say that. So you need to be much more specific depending on the sector. And always supply response by the private sector happens at the interface of economy-wide and sector-specific regulation. For example, if somebody wants to get people to invest in electricity, we know that there are some broad things, protection of property rights, creditor rights, etc., that matter for investors in electricity, but you need to get some things right about electricity markets or about independent power projects, etc., for these things to happen. So both of these things have to come together. And so then Ricardo Hausmann and Danny Roderick said, I forget the exact words, but you're forced to choose which sector to give priority to, because if things happen at the interface of economy-wide and sector-specific measures, and you can't do everything at once, you have to give priority to certain sectors and do that. In that sense, I think there is no disagreement. Then there is the question whether governments can be particularly successful by helping promote particular investments. And one of the investments that would be held up is like the POSCO Steel Company in South Korea, and more broadly, the development as we saw it in Japan and Korea. And there, the evidence as I read it is as follows. Howard Peck from the University of Pennsylvania looked at all the different countries which had active industrial policy support through either trade protection, interest rate protection, or other subsidies. And what they find is they subdivided in each country the developments by sector. And so which sector received how much of these subsidies, and then how was the growth performance of these different sectors. And the outcome is from this study, and they tried to err on the side of favoring government intervention, direct intervention as you put it. And the outcomes is that in Korea and in Japan, but not otherwise, there seems to have been a positive contribution from government. However, that contribution in those when you look at those sectors that benefited from the support and the others that did not, it seemed that the contribution was relatively marginal. And so that the basics of markets is more important than specific government intervention. And then, of course, on the other end of the spectrum, as we all know, you have a bunch of examples in countries. Nigeria's Ajaokuta steel mill, one of the biggest disasters in development, where direct intervention seems to have led not to much progress, but to billions of dollars of waste. And so that then gets us to this thing, which government, what's the government capability that can go together with more direct interventions? And then you have to, in your debates, you have to assess a government or take a view and see whether in this particular case it might make sense. And amongst the governments that I find most capable, to name one, of being a little bit interventionist beyond what one would usually say, is actually the one from Rwanda. One should be careful on which initiative, but there are a few things where they seem to have pulled it off in a reasonable fashion. So altogether, I don't know.
My name is Werner Kiene. I'm a member of the SID board. Thank you for a brilliant presentation. My question is, where do you see civil society in all this? More a driver, more beneficiary of the processes you see or like to see?
The short answer would be civil society is critical in helping create the rule system that enables things to happen. So it was explicit in the slides when it comes to corporate social responsibility. That's one of the interfaces where rulemaking is spurred. And obviously, civil society can play many roles. What I showed there and what I just mentioned is sort of advocacy pieces of civil society. And then, of course, there are other types of civil society operations that actually provide services. And I would think all of those have a role. Where the problem with civil society from a market-based perspective comes is when you have a non-profit organization, and as Tessie mentioned, I used to be in the board of Amnesty International. When you are a non-profit organization, you actually do have to make profit. No? At the end of the year, you have to have a surplus over expenditures, because otherwise you can't pay your employees and can't do your project. It's just that non-profit organizations don't distribute to shareholders. They don't have shareholders. But not having shareholders, of course, means there cannot be a market for corporate control as we understand it in markets. So when a non-profit organization doesn't perform, there's nobody else to buy it up. And when you're in the NGO space, and please make other arguments if you wish, there are lots of little ones, and there's constant debate about